Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Bill Looney, Executive Editor of Vivo. Welcome to this Informa EBD Academy webcast. Our focus today is a key strategic question facing the life science industry: making effective use of that most essential asset, your human capital, your people, your workforce, your skills base, your talent, and most important, your future. No biopharma company can compete today without a people strategy. Now, our objective today in the webcast is twofold. First, it's to present the key findings of a new report, Future-Proofing Human Capital in the Life Sciences, produced by Informa's Educational and Training and Learning Unit, EBD Academy, with the support of Vivo. Second, to enlist an outside practitioner and consultant on talent, culture, and leadership issues to provide a practical interpretation of the study's finding, and to discuss how to turn ideals, precepts, into actual incentives that respond to real-world challenges, incentives that deliver results that can be measured. To do that, we have as our featured guest today, Noushin Dunkelman, a longtime industry research scientist and the founder of Max Synergy Consulting, which advises biotech companies on building an internal culture of excellence. I will introduce her in a moment as we move into the discussion phase of the webinar. But first, I would also like to note the participation of Roisin Manning, who is a service specialist from EBD Academy. She will process your questions, which we have left time for at the end of our program today. Please feel free to use the questions tab on your screen to ask a clarification or additional comment as they arise from Noushin or myself. So let me turn now to a brief overview of our study results. Back in April and May, EBD Academy and Vivo conducted a survey involving 300 leading decision makers in the life sciences sector in the US and Europe. The survey looked for input on key drivers affecting workplace culture, skills training, management practices, including diversity and team-based decision-making, and also leadership behaviors. The survey population covered a lot of ground. 2/3 were drawn from the R&D-based big pharma and biotech sectors. A fifth of the survey were from big pharma, and 15% worked in early-stage biotechs. The remaining percentage of the survey, a third, are from medical devices and the CRO community, contract research organizations. The survey also skewed young, with more than 70% of those polled being age 50 and under, but a fifth were actually over age 55. And on a gender basis, the group was split 60 to 40 male to female. Almost all of those surveyed were director level and above, including strong representation from the key C-suite functions, particularly R&D and clinical. All in all, it was a very representative group in terms of what we find in the overall makeup of the industry today. So let's turn to the first slide, introduction. Do we have that slide, the first slide, introduction? Okay, here we are. Here are the 5 key issues in the report and what we intend to discuss today. First, human capital is certainly top of mind as a strategic priority. It scored 3rd in the survey after regulatory requirements and R&D management. But it's actually larger than that, because if you look at R&D management, for example, that is a major human capital challenge in itself. Second, we see in the survey some confusion as to where the Center for Expertise and Decision-Making on Human Capital Management should lie. It's no longer clear, as in the past, that the traditional human resources function can continue to do it all. Third, we are facing a transition in the composition of the biopharma workforce. Millennials in the survey come across as more demanding in their expectation that personal values and company values should coincide. At the same time, commitment to one employer is fading. So what millennials want most is support for programs that emphasize continuous learning and the ability to learn new skills. Fourth, the survey finds that the big thing about skills is that they should never be static. The greatest skill is actually the soft skill of being adaptable and comfortable in working across disciplines. This is a no-brainer today because every biopharma company in life sciences has to do one essential thing. They have to cope with uncertainty. And fifth, our report rightly puts the CEO at the center of the human capital picture. This is a key area where he or she has to lead and make a mark. Human capital requires the personal stamp of that organization's so-called alpha personality. It cannot be delegated. The CEO's challenge is finding the right set of messages, motivating others to execute around them, and being personally accountable. That's essential in today's social media climate. Now, to move to the next slide, which is top skills for the future. Here we look at what our survey cohort believes will be the most sought after skills in the future. Our time frame is to 2020 and beyond to 2025. So within the next less than a decade. Top rank is regulatory science expertise. It's getting a drug or a device through the development process to testing, final approval, and then post-marketing positioning around issues like safety. This is followed by systems biology and other new science platforms. Data analytics and market access, particularly the launch planning phase, rank third in the same place, essentially. Underlying this slide is the notion that strong skills in the future require more technical capabilities, but that's not enough, because what's also needed is some of the soft, emotive, personality, consensus and communicating building skills that can translate these technical complexities into clarity about the path forward. Everyone needs to be led in a clear direction. In fact, each of these high priority competencies depend on integrating different pools of learning. Their value is when they can be interpreted to illuminate the big picture. So next slide is the C-suite functions. The C-suite is still the place where both strategic and operational priorities are agreed, and then they're cascaded down the management chain. They're the corporation's chief decision-making entity, with the exception of the board of directors. C-suite executives are being repositioned, however, as facilitators rather than taskmasters. They help to remove barriers to team actions rather than simply enforcing arbitrary targets. That's something our survey found, which I think is very, very important as to where we get the management skills in companies today and tomorrow. This shows our survey group lists 3 positions: Chief Scientific Officer, Chief Innovation Officer, and Chief Business Development Officer as prime candidates for new entries to the C-suite. Some of these functions, as you know, particularly business development, are already being done. But the issue is they need to be upgraded, they need to be prioritized. And what all of these 3 share is a focus on finding new ways to grow the business organically and through collaboration. It's interesting on your chart that you see that the post of Chief Patient Officer, which a few companies like Merck and Sanofi have embraced and was actually a rather fad a few years ago, figures much lower as a standard bearer in the future, at least according to our survey population. Now the next slide, which is on millennials. This is the population cohort under the age of 35. And they are now the biggest block in the population base. They last year exceeded the baby boom generation. But it's not surprising that this youth factor, the millennials, put a strong emphasis on opportunity for professional growth as a reason for joining their current employer. Let's move on to the next slide. This is about top management functions, the functions that drive business success in the future. Again, it's a big picture perspective, accomplished through cross-functional collaborations among different assets. This is what counts the most. Human resources and talent development must work to find that combination of technical expertise and a high-touch communication and people awareness mindset. That has to be definitely present in the top management, but it also needs to be seeded down through the organization. And the problem is many recruits today to the business, they don't have both sides of the brain, so to speak. So how to find these qualities in the applicant population is an area where data science, predictive algorithms, and some of the new technologies can be brought to bear, and some companies are already putting them to use. The final slide is the future pressure points on the CEO. Now, in this one, it's somewhat obvious, but technology change is the definite disruptor on the biopharma life science business model. It's not only because technology costs a lot of money to address it, it also promises to change everything from the nature of work and also to making the innovations, not just in the laboratory, but also more importantly, in what's required to manufacture a biologic drug more expensively than the cost of producing the product itself. That seems to be a big trend. We're seeing that a lot in FDA applications. Risk is also emerging as a business-wide responsibility. It's no longer safely pigeonholed as simply a compliance problem. Dealing with risk has to be systematic because everyone ultimately has to be aware of risk. And traditionally, that isn't always the case in large companies and even small ones that are struggling to generate a single product from an idea. But in a digital world, every exposure is a point of vulnerability, especially to the integrity of the supply chain. So this is seen as a big challenge to the next generation of CEOs about incorporating that sense of risk and urgency everywhere in the organization. And finally, let's look larger at the report when it looks at some key gaps in the armamentarium to build that human capital base. We're focusing on gaps here. One, as I just said, the pace of technology, and the real issue is, are companies prepared to deal with it, to address it, to benefit from it? And then skills, much more must be done to focus on the needs of the individual rather than the group learning. It's a tailored approach to skills development, which is more challenging, particularly in larger organizations. The C-suite also needs refreshing with new functions linked to the vital task of seeding innovation in all parts of the organization. And on talent strategy, it's always now an issue of finding the right home for it in the organization. The sense, perhaps, is that human resources has evolved too much in a way of being simply a benefits administrator, and that someone needs to take the heavy lifting of taking human capital and making it live and breathe and succeed with support. So that's a brief discussion of the study and the report, which I believe all of you will be getting at the conclusion of this webcast. So let's turn now to the discussion part of today's meeting. And joining me, as I said, is our guest expert, Noushin Dunkelman, who's founder and president of Max Synergy Consulting. Now, Noushin has a 25-year career in the industry, beginning with a series of increasingly responsible roles in process and product development. She's definitely a graduate of the lab. And she worked in both biotech R&D and manufacturing at the mid-size and startup level. In her current role as an organization management consultant, Noushin advises on growth strategies, mobilizing people behind strong corporate cultures, performance standards, leadership behaviors, diversity training, and mentoring. She also does some interesting things, which we maybe could explore later, is on remote team management, and also making external scientific collaborations work. These are among her current consultancy assignments. And lacing all this together is her strong belief that organizational excellence begins with clarity in communications. And also, it's possible to build a strong culture, assuming you have that clarity and that ability to communicate. So welcome, Noushin.
Thank you, Bill.
Great. So let's, to begin the discussion, to expand on your background a bit. Like, why did you make the transition from a technical and science role to being an expert in organizational behavior? Were you not seeing enough results on the science side and realized the weak link was the organization response? Or, maybe what are the barriers to that good idea, and maybe that's what you're doing now?
Well, the short answer is yes. I always say in biotech, we hire smart people. And for most part, we have good scientific ideas. And what I have found that even my own experience from when I was working with biotech, that we kind of fail at delivering results because we struggle with effective communication. effective collaboration, problem solving as a team. So for me, looking at my career trajectory, I felt that I can continue impacting one organization at a time, or I can help our industry by providing my skill set to help more companies succeed. Because most of the CEOs who hired me was not only for my technical skills, but being able to bring the team together and solving those problems. And I think this is where we struggle the most in our industry.
Right. Well, Noushin, that follows up from that is that, so what are the key problems that you're doing now to solve within these organizations in biotech? What are your clients asking you to do about problems? What are the problems in a general way?
I would say the main issues are around communication. A lot of it is around role clarity and certain processes that are missing as far as how to disseminate decisions so people can work cohesively together. So those are some of the main issues.
Right. And would this, you mainly work with smaller biotechs, as I understand it. Some people would say, well, why would that be a problem in a small organization? Is size, does that have anything to do with the ability to achieve these kind of concepts of better communication and clarity? Do you have that problem in small organizations too?
Believe it or not, it exists in companies that are 5 people all the way to organizations that I work with that are 100.
Interesting.
So, and I always say communication is a leadership problem. It's a problem for leadership, not that it is a leadership problem. It is a problem that the leadership needs to acknowledge and address. Even smaller companies, people don't know how to provide effective feedback to one another, how to even discuss challenges effectively, and getting people in alignment. We are very good at problem solving individually, but when we come together, sometimes that is the struggle. Learning how to collaboratively work together becomes a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard this often, that sometimes it's harder to manage 5 people than it is to manage 500.
Well, there's no place to hide, right? They're right in each other's face all the time.
Right, right. And of course, when you're dealing with only 5 people, there is sometimes an uncomfortable level of intimacy in getting things done, which in a larger organization can be turned into bullet points. But at any rate, that's a good insight about managing in today's world. I'd like to reap some of the benefits from your work with companies to kind of create a supplement to the survey that we just did. Generally speaking, would you agree with the conclusions I presented on the survey, or is there anything that you think stands out that we didn't touch on? Any comments about the survey first?
No, I think it is well, it captures literally all the issues that you guys have captured are absolutely something that I see in most of the organization I work with. There is nothing that I can see at this point that it was missed. I'm sure during our conversation, I might be bringing some comments that are just based on my own experience of working that might add to what you guys have already published. Right.
So that brings me to the question I wanted to pose is, so you've been consulting a lot in the last, when did you actually leave small biotech for your current role?
About 4 years ago.
4 years. So within the last 5 years or so, maybe you could describe some lesson points derived from your work with different clients. I mean, one area where you have been engaged is helping CEOs define a strategy for a biotech at the startup phase. So maybe one example is, what's actually necessary to creating this vision that you talked about and then communicating it effectively, because a small biotech has to do that, because if it doesn't, it won't get talent and it won't get funding. So how did you help them jump that hurdle?
Yeah, so I think vision is really one of the things that I see some of the CEOs, the most effective CEOs use to align their team. So one of the things that we talk about is having the vision to be very clear, so it's easily understood by all. The trick is to create a solid vision statement that is easily translatable by everyone in the organization into the action of their day-to-day. So I always, even with my team when I was leading them, when they had problems to solve or they would get lost in the day-to-day actions, that vision was able to get them refocused and also be able to help them solve problems effectively. So to me, when I work with the CEOs, is saying that it definitely has to be a clear message to the team, so and they can see that how that relates to them. And second thing, I do believe a lot of the people in our industry would like it to be something of a challenge. So I think what drives and attract talent is the element of challenge and problem solving. Really, for myself, what drove me to working with companies I worked with was based on novel areas of research and solving difficult problems that add meaningful impact to people's lives. So I think that's the piece, is something that's challenging, something that's clear, and actually the passion that the CEO has about the product that they're working on is, I would say, the third piece that I emphasize a lot.
Right. So challenge is definitely a key part of this process of developing the vision to make it proactive, forward-looking, and actually serious that you want to do something significant, and that's a way to attract talent and capital. But what about the issue of executing? A lot of companies, particularly big ones, they expend millions and millions of dollars and lots of time and resources to develop this overarching vision statement. And then what happens is when it's presented, it tends to fall by the wayside. So do you have any advice for, again, maybe the smaller companies, as how to turn that passion, that vision that you incorporate in a document into real live effectiveness by people on the ground? Is it the CEO saying the same thing over and over again? Is it different platforms? I mean, you put it up on a website. Maybe you could discuss a little bit more to how to turn a vision into something living.
Yeah, so one of the things that we also talk about significantly is how to keep it alive. Just having it on the wall or on the website, it really is meaningless to your team. I always, once we have established the vision, my recommendation and what we work toward is getting the leadership, the rest of the management, to fully understand and support it, and they are also spokesperson for the vision. The CEO, I always say, over communicate the vision. Repetition is your friend, and you repeat it, whether it's in your all hands, your team meetings, in your one-on-ones, when appropriate. It is designed so that it lives in your people's mind and heart. And in organizations that I've seen that are successful is when they actually repeat what the CEO has been saying in all hands meeting. It almost becomes, you have to repeat it so many times for people to start incorporating it. So it is through communication, truly, not just only by CEO, but the leadership team as well, and people who manage.
Good. Let's move on to the issue. Another crucial issue in all organizations today is how to create an effective team. Most decisions are being made today in teams rather than individuals. So what's the first thing that management must do to ensure that you have that team performance, which I think is based on kind of a harmonious engagement built around tolerance for diversity. I mean, how do you create the effective team-based decision-making down the ranks?
So I think one of the critical pieces is alignment at the leadership. I have had CEOs who, call me up for providing my services, and they're saying, their team is not working well together, and they don't seem to be able to meet their timelines, and there's struggles among the team. And when I actually do my assessment of the organization, what I see is that is a lot of misalignment at the top level, and that ripples of misalignment at the top actually creates larger and stronger waves at the lower level of the organization. So I would say alignment is the most critical piece at the leadership. It starts from the top.
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying too that top management has to change its modus operandi to be a facilitator as opposed to being someone that just says do this. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying that even at the higher level, when there are disagreements as far as how decisions are made, or that once the decisions are made, there has to be alignment for it to be communicated effectively with the rest of the team, because they're always looking up. They're always looking how the leaders are interacting, communicating with one another. For example, yesterday I was in an organization, and we were going through their goal setting and how they were going to be as leaders going to be communicating. And one of the things that I was telling them, that even if you're waiting for someone else to have a project done before you can start your own, you can't start finger pointing one another out from a leadership perspective if one group is not providing the information or services that you need. You need to be more of a problem solver as a leader, and creating that collaborative feel across the organization, saying how can we communicate this better with our team members, creating that alignment even at that level, that then people can see and take lead from how the leaders actually behave and interact with one another.
Right, but one a follow-up to that is that a lot of companies embrace team-based decision-making, but when you look at their structures, their organizational structure, they're all very siloed still. So how do you reconcile the issue of team engagement with the fact that many companies still are built around silo organizations? And this is a particular issue in the clinical and R&D side because you have different factions within a R&D operation. And then on top of that, the essence of commercialization today is to bring commercial market access people into the decision-making mix, which again creates a whole nother layer of silos. So is it possible to be an effective team in a siloed organization?
Absolutely not. And that's the piece that even the small companies struggle with. Some of it is because we are moving so fast that the speed of the information that needs to get across the organization is not happening. But also the governance, the decision-making governances are not very clear at some organizations. So for me, when I'm working with organizations, that's one of the things that I focus on is who are the decision makers? How does the decision come to the team level, and what decision that the team themselves can be making, and knowing when they can make decision and when do they need to take it to the next level for endorsement or buy-in. So this is, again, that process that sometimes lacks in organizations and creates these silos, right? So first of all, being an effective organization is acknowledging and addressing silos, but then filling up those gaps by processes that help the team communicate more effectively. Part of the role clarity, believe it or not, is that this piece is what information do I need from you? What information do you need from me in order for you to be successful? So to me, that is, again, a management responsibility to create effective governance and processes for the team to communicate.
Great. Let's also talk now about the issue of culture in a company. You know, people have very strong views about culture. Some people say it's a fabrication. Other people say it's there, it counts, it's important. I think your perspective is in the latter side. But in the work that you're doing right now, how do you evaluate a culture? Do you evaluate a culture and then recommend ways to transform or change that culture? Can you do that, or how does culture be replenished from the top of the ranks, and what decisions does a company have to make to give its culture, you know, the root to grow?
So I would say culture is something that is kind of a forgotten thing when we start biotech companies. Most biotech companies focus on technical and financial aspect of running their organization with no to little attention to their culture. So I think I always say to my CEOs, we need to be intentional about creating the culture. And some of the organization I get involved with, they already have a culture. They can't necessarily say that they have worked on creating the culture. So whatever that was there has propagated, and trying to move the culture or change the culture takes a bit of time and involvement. So one of the things that when I get involved with organization is really reevaluating their core values and understanding where the CEO wants the culture to be. And an example where I work with the teams in some organization, not all, some of the CEOs want the culture to be something that have a lot of input from the grassroots. So we meet as teams, cross-functional teams, to actually discuss the core values for the company. What do we do well now? What we want to keep? What are things that are not working for our organization? And what do we need to be successful going forward? So once we develop the core values, then we communicate it up to the management and get buy-in there. And then we also have the teams have culture ambassador teams where they work within the organization with smaller groups to communicate the core values, to actually facilitate keeping it alive in the organization by creating ways that we can actually acknowledge people who are effectively working toward what the changes we want to make. So it is not only the CEO's responsibility for this culture, is really getting the rest of the team. I always say it's not one person's responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility to create the changes for the cultures that they need to see. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but
Yes, thanks. I think you kind of raised a number of process issues that, you know, in some ways companies tend to ignore when they realize the need to take an organization in a different direction. So,
and also hiring, Bill. The biggest thing is hiring the right people into your organization is how you also develop and maintain a culture. First, you need to have your values and your culture set up, but then to maintain it and have it grow, you need to make sure you're hiring for your values and for your culture.
Oh, good. That's a good point. So looking forward, looking ahead down the road, our EBD survey identifies some, we call them next wave issues that might shape the workforce and require new skills, and also, you know, different ways to get things done. So I'm going to ask you a couple of them to see if you could comment on some of these trends from the survey. The first is diversity. This is a big issue for companies today, big and small. It's seen as an aid to innovation. It's seen as a progressive activity that needs to be encouraged. But how do you define it? Because a lot of companies have trouble defining diversity. That's one question. And then what are the advantages of this diversity? What does it bring to the organization? And are there pitfalls at attempting to quantify diversity success?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not sure if I know how to define the diversity, but when I was building my own team, I wanted to make sure I had team members with varied areas of expertise and years of experience. And for me, the focus, especially with startup to mid-sized companies, we're just focused on hiring people with certain skill sets. So I am not sure, at least at the levels that I am working with, that the focus is really hiring for diversity per se, but it's really focused on skills and experience. I just want to add one additional note on this, that there are companies that I'm working with that have created remote working organization and culture. Yeah. They ensure that they hire the best person for the position. Again, focus is on experience and knowledge, but based on that, I've noticed the company naturally creates a diverse team. When that's one thing that I have noticed in the work that I'm doing with the teams that I'm working with. But diversity is a challenge if we are trying to quantify it and measure it, because we do need for each role a certain experience and knowledge. So,
right. I mean, as you know, in the tech sector, it's become an issue of controversy because there's different views on how you measure diversity. But generally speaking, I think the advantage of diversity, if you walk into an office and meet a team, and if there are people from different geographies and also other different elements of diversity, it says something very clear about the organization and what it wants to do. So I think you'd agree with me that diversity is a key part of future planning around human capital. It's just that it has to be seen almost as an end in itself, as not something that has to be measured to fit the views of certain regulators or others is really the key, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, looking at gender-based pay and performance, it's a big issue in our survey. There was differences between men and women in the way they answered different questions about work standards and pay and performance particularly. And the survey did show that 62%, I think, of the population, of the entire population, thought that it would be good to have a gendered pay audit segment or procedure as a way to recruit female talent in the future. It's a big issue in the UK and other markets as well. So do you have any comments about gender-based pay and performance? A very sensitive issue. Yeah.
It is, and I think even in the States, they are looking to some of the regulations around issues like this. So this might not be a popular thought, but I want to share some of my own experiences. Since I've been in small to mid-sized biotech, one thing I can say, I found that when I used to interview women for position, most did not have a good understanding of what market value was for their position they were applying for. But their counterpart, when I think of men that I was interviewing, they were more effective about knowing how much they like to get paid, and they were willing to negotiate. I always told my potential new hires, you need to know how much you want to get paid. I can tell you that if it is within my budget or not, but people need to know their value. And I think being a woman and working and coaching a lot of women, I see that hesitation of really knowing their own value when they go to interview, and also be willing to negotiate, not taking the first proposal per se. And the other thing is, one of the things that I also see is men have less, even though if they have less experience, they're willing to apply and present themselves ready for position above their experience. But I do see a lot of women who are well experienced, have the credential, and they still don't think they have it from A to Z in order to apply for the next level. So I think there is also I would like to recommend for us as women to also change our mindset that we need to ask for what we deserve, and also acknowledge our own abilities, and negotiate.
Yeah, the challenges for companies is really to get ahead of these underlying cultural realities. That's
absolutely. And I think when it becomes larger organizations, the regulations probably can work more effectively. But when you have 5 to 20 people, I'm not sure how effective the regulations.
Yeah, that's a good point. But in some ways, it gives the manager more discretion to act in a better way than he might in a larger or he or she might in a larger organization. It's complicated. The next one is building the talent base. We have a we saw in the survey, massive competition for talent from the tech industry, adjacent industries outside of life sciences that are looking for a stake there. So what do you think is not being done right now to raise the quality of the talent pool and keep your best people happy, engaged, and the like? What are the things that aren't being done?
The key point for most people is, developing and growing. So in our area of, small to mid-sized biotech, the funding is so limited that a lot of the companies don't tend to invest in their teams' growth. So I think having a culture that supports their team to continue learning and growing in their positions is one of the key parameters that I notice is missing in the teams, in the organizations that I work with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then related to this is what we call the restructuring wave.
Mm-hmm.
In an era of uncertainty, and let's face it, the business model in pharma is frayed in some ways. They use layoffs as a standard practice now. We've just seen 7,000 job cuts at Teva, 3,500 in Lilly. First of all, is there a state-of-the-art way to do this? Or is there a credibility problem for pharma underlying that, in terms that it seems to be changing its priorities around human capital over and over again very frequently? Short-termism, is that it? Or?
Yeah, there are no easy way to lay off your team members. I think I agree with you that you see these large sequential, as you say, that the 7,000 cuts approach in getting rid of people because of various reasons. But I think I don't have a perfect example or answer for this thing, but in my experience, we need to have a plan for execution. really treating the people who are leaving the organization with respect and care. I think a lot of times, even when I had to downsize, was part of groups that had to downsize our organization. It was more about the people who were left behind versus the people who were leaving. If you were treating the people who were leaving fairly, and the reason for the downsizing was clear, and communicating it effectively was effective to a certain extent, because then the people who stayed behind did not feel as demotivated and lost, because they think, okay, the next time it's me. They knew that if it was time, that they will be treated the same way. I don't have a good answer for these large cuts that the pharmas do, but even in small biotech, we do this, believe it or not, as frequently as every couple of years, because sometimes we overgrow the organization, funding dries up, and you have to let people go. But it is about how we let those people go.
Right. I just want to ask you one question about millennials. They're now, as I said, the biggest cohort in the workforce generally in most US and European countries. There's a perception that's been said that millennials have a different view about work and careers than baby boomers or older generations do. Is there some truth to that, or is this kind of a bit of an exaggeration that basically all workers are the same? Is there a different way to motivate a younger worker? That's my question, kind of.
Sure. So the companies that I work with that do have millennials, I have had a lot of discussion with them, and I find that they want things that were not important to, for example, Gen X and baby boomers in that sense. They want frequent feedback and touch point, where in our generation, once a year was potentially enough, which is not really true. But they want to have more input in what they're doing. They don't value staying at one position for a long time. We took pride in being in an organization for 20 years. They don't see that to be as critical. They don't mind being mobile in that sense. And they also feel like they need fulfillment in their work. And they're not as driven by dollar or money as previous generations. And this work-life balance, which I still think needs to be better defined for this group. But I believe the millennials need to be coached, not judged. Although they're smart, they need to understand that they can't replace experience, because they've been obtaining information and getting everything is at the tip of their finger as far as information, where the older generation, had to solve problems. So I think one of the things that is lacking for the millennial is the critical thinking, that they can't conclude an answer quickly and move on. They need to be thoughtful around that. And I think creating an organization where we can couple, older generation with the millennial, to actually they learn from each other. And I think they find, even in a couple of organizations where we have created this working together, where they can learn from one another, learning that, the new technology from an elder generation, to the fact that the millennial actually can learn this process of thinking and evaluating problems that they're solving at a deeper level. So I don't know if I was able to get you the answer you're looking for.
Sure, that gave some context. Finally, just quickly, I can't end this without talking about leadership and leader behaviors, because they're the people who steer the ship in life sciences. Is there a characteristic today or tomorrow of an ideal leader personality in our business, or is that a wrong way to approach this issue, and that actually great leaders can be distinctly different?
I think great leaders can be distinctly different. I know a lot of people think, you know, you need an extrovert versus, you know, somebody who's, you know, is able to pump their team up. But I've worked with, you know, introverts who are very effective as well. And I believe leadership is a skill, and you can learn to become a leader if you're willing to work at it. So I don't believe there is one magic bullet for being a leader.
So it's kind of contextual, and it's not something you can teach in a seminar.
So I believe, okay, I used to think leadership was something that you were born with, but I can say with confidence that it is not. That if you're interested, you can learn to be an effective leader. It requires desire and hard work, those two things. And I always say it's leaders are like scientists. They learn by trying out new tools and figure out what works and what doesn't. And they can be, you know, critic of their own performance and, you know, optimize as they go forward. But definitely they can improve by getting feedback and incorporating it.
Great, great. Well, thanks, Noushin. This was great. Some insights and practical experience I think you've added can provide some heft to the data from our survey group. So as I said earlier in the beginning, we'll end our discussion today. I'd like to turn it over to Roisin Manning of EBD Academy, who has some questions from the audience today. Roisin?
Thanks, Bill. Noushin, here's one for you. People aside, what's your view on the one or two biggest external challenges facing the life science industry right now?
I think fundraising, funding is a huge, you know, access to grant money has gotten harder, especially for startup companies. And I also think partnering with big pharma is another challenge because they are more risk adverse, and now they're looking to getting kind of a phase 2, phase 3 data before even engaging with the companies, where before, you know, preclinical data was enough for them to be willing to fund certain aspect of your project. And lastly, I think regulatory area is constantly changing. I was working with an organization where, you know, they're ready for their phase 3, and you know, FDA decided to change their definition of how they will allow enrollment. So those are real issues, and they're costly to our industry.
Okay, great. Another question. What, in your experience, is the most common problem you see when biotech companies attempt to create a stronger organization and company culture? What is the best approach to solving it?
So communication, I still think, is the biggest problem in our organization. Is again, going back to what we said earlier, is creating clear communication channels and processes is needed for people to know how decisions are made. How do we communicate those decisions? How do we provide and receive feedback from our team is the one that I would emphasize.
Okay, and finally, given the issues we've identified in the EBD survey, can you summarize what you consider to be the key abilities and attributes for career success in the life sciences in 2020 and beyond? What will CEOs have to do to attract these top performers?
I would say flexibility. You know, having people who are open to change and ability to adapt to change. Because I always say one thing that is constant in our industry is change. So having team members who are able to pivot as the organization needs to pivot, and also for the CEO and the organization, create a culture and environment where people, you know, when there's new opportunity, to give people opportunity to explore new abilities that they have and be able to, you know, as we're moving from, let's say, research to development, to provide them the tools and the opportunity to take on the new challenges that are there for them with the changes that are needed for the organization.
I guess that's a good summary of the questions we received for the audience, and I totally concur with what you said, Noushin, at the end. I would just add to the point is that the key issue, I think, for career success, one key issue is the ability to know your customer, because this industry has a changing customer base. Some we don't even know who the customer is. So to be able to understand that and be aware of it is critical to taking innovation and making it marketable in the patient population. So that's another thing to consider where human capital counts. But anyway, thanks for that. Our time is up and we must bring the discussion to a close. I kind of summarized all of we talked about today is that, in one thought, it's no biopharma can succeed without a people strategy. No machine can replace the human mind in the struggle to innovate. And this is the area, the arena, where the competitive battles of the 21st century in life sciences will be fought. So it's very top of mind as a subject. I'd like to thank Noushin Dunkelman for her contributions to this critical issue, to my EBD Academy associates, including Roisin Manning, who are responsible for the survey report, and of course to you, the audience, for tuning in today. This webcast has been recorded, and we will, at the Academy, we will be in touch on how to access the recording shortly. And I'm also pleased to say on behalf of the EBD Academy that all the registrants for today's webinar will receive via email a copy of the 28-page report, as I said, Future-Proofing Human Capital in the Life Sciences. So that concludes the webcast today. Good day and good business, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.